So thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to talk about a new service we're building called the Global Intelligence Insights that can be applied across your use cases. Global Intelligence Insights leverages Sumo Logic platform, its breadth, its reach, and its scope to derive what we call the global context to help you put your data in the global context. You might ask yourself, what is this global context that we're talking about? It could be as simple as what types of technologies are being adopted by your peers, right? What kind of services in the cloud, what kind of application componentry is being adopted to solve specific types of workload use cases. But it could be much more specific than that. It could be as specific as what are the common failure rates for specific types of application componentry. What are the common events? What are the uncommon events? What are the common and uncommon security conditions across those types of applications and infrastructure? And so we think that this type of data is going to be helpful across the entire technology adoption lifecycle. This type of data can be very helpful, we think, during your early stages of technology adoption, right? When you are architecting your application, when you're picking the workload, the components that are going to compose your workload to solve the problem that you're trying to solve with your application, right? This is very much what you will be seeing and reading inside of your modern apps reports that is, I believe, in your bags, and which is soon going to be live on our website. So this type of information is soon going to be available directly through our website in real time. Like, what is the technology adoption trends that we're seeing across our global customer base, right? Also, this can be very helpful during your sort of late production stage of your technology adoption lifecycle. When you're going into load testing, when you're trying to figure out whether you're getting the right performance out of your application and componentry before you go to production, or even in production when you're tuning your application, tuning your components, figuring out to get more out of it for either better SLA, better experience, lowering cost or what have you. And then as you go into the operations aspect of operations of security, operations for monitoring, for DevOps, or what have you, also it can be helpful to understand whether the conditions that you're experiencing inside of your application are common, uncommon, serious, not serious, to basically be able to gather this information from the community of experts, people like your peers, and be able to leverage that to accelerate your troubleshooting, to accelerate your root cause identification, and so on and so forth. So we're going to take this step by step. We're going to go through some examples. We're going to save some time at the end for questions, but I wanted to start in the early stage. So in the early stage of technology adoption, you might be picking a workload, or you might be moving to the cloud. Many of you here, are cloud first, right? Many of you were born in the cloud, like we were. Some of you are in AWS, others might be in GCP or other clouds. But you better believe that majority of people outside of this room and maybe Silicon Valley and a few other centers around the world are not very familiar with what cloud services are like, what they deliver, how to use them, what's the appropriate thing to adopt, right? So I'm going to deep dive into AWS services. And before I go into slides, I want to ask a couple of questions. How many of you who are in AWS think you consume or adopt fewer than 10 AWS services? If you can raise your hand. Fewer than 10? Okay. Fewer than 20? Fewer than 30? Okay. So we're tracking nearly 200 AWS services. And this is what it looks like globally. 90% of users adopt fewer than 30 AWS services. Half of the companies leveraging cloud services adopt fewer than 20. At Sumo, we use 31. So we've been in the cloud for almost 9 years now, and so that might be the reason. But it is really interesting that out of almost 200 services, 90% of people use fewer than 30. Another question. How many of you think that EC2 is amongst the top 5 services adopted on AWS? Top 5? S3, top 5? Lambda, top 5? Okay. So, Lambda is top 5. S3 is not. EC2 is top 5. Long tail. Remember, 30 services adopted by 90% of customers all clump on this left side of the chart. It's interesting, you know, a lot of the services on the left side of the chart are the basic compute, storage, and database services, right? So we find really interesting information as you go and move through your technology adoption lifecycle to what are you going to take, what are you going to adopt when you're migrating your workload, when you're re-architecting your workload. And then you might ask yourselves, what services might be leveraged together as you adopt cloud services? David.
Yep, so as you're kind of adopting, looking at which services might be relevant to your workload, to your use case, one possible way to kind of anchor that search is to look at what services you're using today. And so to that end, we've constructed this kind of social network of AWS services. And in this graph, which is a little zoomed out, and we'll dive into it in a little more detail in a second, the individual nodes are some popular AWS services, and the edges represent, you know, kind of friendships between these services, by which I mean that they're very often used by the same customers.
Is this by Facebook or by Twitter?
Yeah, that's right. So it's the social network of AWS services. And if you say two services always get used together, they're going to have a stronger edge. Two services which are never used together are going to have no edge. And why we think this is potentially an interesting and useful thing as you are adopting cloud technologies, executing a new project, migrating existing workloads, that this could potentially help you navigate amongst the hundreds of AWS services, or eventually the hundreds of AWS services, other components you might be using, everything like this. There's a huge kind of world of technology choices, and we're not proposing to kind of choose for you, but we want to give you the most information and context possible to kind of make the most efficient use of your time. Which services are you going to invest the effort to kind of stand up a version of, experiment with, learn a little bit more about. And this kind of data-driven categorization of these services is potentially a useful way to do this. So digging a little bit more into which services often get used together, you know, you can say code build, code commit, code pipeline. Not very surprisingly, they're often used together. So these connections, again, often used together. And the coloring actually is derived from a clustering algorithm we run over the graph that is kind of theoretically related to sort of graph cut theory. It's spectral clustering. And basically, services that have a lot of edges in common are more likely to be put in these clusters together. And what this essentially gives us is sort of a data-driven discovery of kind of almost tech stack-like idea. This bundle of services seems to be often used together in the wild, in the customer base. So this is potentially, there's something there that this kind of, they play well together, they constitute a coherent piece of functionality together. If you're using one or more of them, you might be interested in what the other ones are that make up the rest of that cluster. Those might be a good place to kind of anchor your initial exploratory, you know, discussions of what technologies you might want to adopt. So some of these kind of example ones, ECS tasks, ECS, auto scaling. Again, this is very sensible that these guys kind of run together because they sort of constitute this nice auto scaling container, you know, orchestration workload. And likewise, IoT and some API related services, again, the data kind of show us that very often these are being used in concert, in tandem together by our customers. So when you are standing up a new initiative, we're not, you know, you still have to do your homework, do your due diligence, everything like this. But these kind of starter packs, these sort of tech stacks, can give you a nice way to sort of accelerate that early research and discovery phase of your project by taking a look at which other services do, same as Modern App Report, which services are being used, how are they being used together. And this all just kind of emerges from the data, which is really interesting. You know, again, this build deploy stack, very kind of CI/CD in a box, sort of AWS suite of services. Not surprising to see those guys together. Data analytics, the data pipeline, Elastic MapReduce, kind of make a nice ETL sort of style stack. And you know, that's a different way that you can have these AWS services that are sort of working together. However, of course, there's going to be a lot of things that you want to do that are not necessarily supplied, or you might not want to be using the AWS service for whatever reason. And so, again, Modern App Report, how are we going to help you with that? Again, kind of pulling in this global context, this global intelligence to help you make the most efficient use of your time and kind of get your products and new initiatives to market as fast as possible. So this is actually from Modern App Report. Bruno showed you the website before. It's of course in your bag. You can find it online, all of this good stuff. And again, say that, okay, we are looking at databases and I know that I have document workload. I'm thinking NoSQL. I want something kind of supporting high speed. So I look at what are some popular databases amongst the community today, what are the best practices, and I decide I want to go with Mongo. All right, this is great. I can start setting it up and all of this, but if you're going to be running it in AWS on EC2 yourself, you know your work is not yet done. You're going to say, what instance type should I stand up my Mongo on? And this is another place where we can potentially help. So just looking globally, what are the wisdom of the crowd kind of saying? What are sort of the best practices, or what are the common practices among the user population for running MongoDB workload? And we can see that M4 large and T2 medium are sort of the big champions here. So again, nothing is going to kind of save you the work of really sizing out your workload, doing some more detailed benchmarking, kind of doing your due diligence. But as a starting place, you could do a lot worse than sort of saying, well, what are other people kind of doing? This is kind of best practices emerging naturally from the data that can kind of help you get through that phase of your development process more quickly. And we can kind of look, okay, what are the families? You can slice and dice this data in a different way. General purpose and memory are some popular choices. This also potentially interesting. You could also say, let's say that we want to narrow it down to the M4. What size are people typically using here? Large is a popular choice, and there's a bunch of other choices. But again, this data actually kind of tell you what is a reasonable initial starting place to kind of anchor your early prototyping, early experiments, how you're going to kind of spend your time. Say, and again, maybe you want to do the whole exercise also for web server. Again, from the Modern App Report, Apache, IIS, Nginx, these are some really popular choices. You can see there's actually some really interesting behavior as far as what EC2 instance types people are using here. And again, if this is a bit much to digest, we can drill down a little bit more and look at the families and the sizes. And the one kind of qualitative bit that emerges from this chart for me is that people are more likely to be using the specialized memory instance or compute instances with IIS. So I'm not sure if they're running more specialized workload, it has more specialized needs or requirements, but what this data can kind of tell you, even as not necessarily an IIS expert yourself if you're not, is that maybe it's worth investigating these alternative instance types because often other people are kind of making that choice to use the more specialized instance families with this particular web server. So again, not out to kind of do your job for you, but can kind of accelerate you and give you some hints, nudge you, give you a reasonable starting place, accelerate your efforts. So now, congratulations, you've chosen an instance type, chosen a database, chosen a bunch of AWS services, and now you're actually standing up the whole service. You've got some initial prototypes, you're developing, and you start collecting the logs. You're collecting the metrics. Okay, what are you going to do with them? Hopefully dump them into Sumo Logic. Now, which ones to look at? How should you chart them? Hopefully we've got an app for that. So now you look at the very nice app dashboard and you see, oh, here's how my read latency looks, here's how my write latency looks. Very good. Are those numbers making any sense? That's a big question if you're not necessarily subject matter expert for that database. If you're getting MongoDB insert latency P99 of 620 milliseconds, is that good? Is that bad? Is that expected? Is that unexpected? If you're an expert, maybe you know, but if not, we want to kind of give you the benefit of the data to sort of anchor your search again. How can we optimize your database utilization and performance with the data? And this is the global kind of benchmark idea, where we're going to allow you to sort of compare various performance and utilization metrics for a given database against the average, the median, the 75 percentile, 25 percentile for the larger population of users. And this may or may not be the last word in database performance for you, but again, as you're prototyping, as you're developing, this can give you a sanity check. This can give you some kind of like community guidance, some idea what are, if not best practices, it's common practices. If you stand up your initial prototype system and you are having 10x the read latency of the population average, that might be something you should stop and take a look. Have I configured it correctly? Have I deployed it correctly? Something like this. So this can kind of anchor your search again in a useful way. Now, what you might be thinking is that, oh, I'm using the database very differently than other people. My use case is so unique that this global average is not necessarily going to be super meaningful or relevant or helpful for you. And you may be thinking this because maybe you're one of the customers we've talked to about it who has literally told us that. And so that kind of leads to the next phase of discussion, where we want to look at how much similarity and variation there is in these workloads. And the idea here is that these global benchmarks, they're kind of telling you the total population behavior, but what might be more meaningful or relevant for you is how are other similar peers in your industry potentially using it, or how are other people who are using the database in the same way using it. So these plots, these kind of polar coordinate plots, are sort of representing a bunch of different database metrics, and these can be some like different clusters of utilization. And this kind of 3D scatter plot is showing how the variation is across different database instances and snapshots in time. And not to dig too much into the details of what's going on in this plot, but the structure here indicates that actual observed workloads we're seeing in these databases, they are different, but for the most part, they're not unique. So your database utilization is likely to be different than somebody else's, but not totally unique in the universe. Their database workload utilization multivariate metrics, in some sense, can be said to lie on sort of a low-dimensional manifold. There's kind of a limited scope of variability and a handful of buckets that constitute sort of typical behavior. Qualitatively, we might say like read-heavy workload, write-heavy workload, transaction processing, this kind of thing. So the idea is, can we take advantage of that and deliver a personalized benchmark to you that's more tailored to either your sort of industry peers or your usage and behavior patterns for the database. And so this is kind of what we're looking at now. And the idea here, this is kind of scatter plot of some latency for a database metric versus some utilization pattern. And the line is not a perfect fit, but it's a better fit than the global average. And we're going to keep looking and kind of iterating on this with the goal of delivering to you sort of an expected performance characteristic for databases, other components, that is actually related to how you're using the component. If you're doing tons and tons of heavy write load, your expectation of performance might not necessarily be the same as somebody who does almost no writes and very light read load, right? So this is, again, hopefully going to be something that kind of accelerates your development process, accelerates your decision making, and helps you get a more useful and meaningful comparison of how your software and components are behaving versus the kind of average and the average of your jury of your peers in the Sumo Logic community. So we think this is some really potentially helpful stuff.
All right, thanks, David. Okay, so now you've done your technology selection, you've picked how you're going to run it, you are learning about performance, you're benchmarking yourself, and now you're maybe at the pre-production load testing. You're ready to ship your application, but you want to make sure your performance is right, it's delivering what you think it needs to deliver to your customers, it's delivering on SLAs, and maybe it's not breaking the bank, right? Can you get more out of your dollars? And so, maybe you want to now start testing your infrastructure at scale and comparing that against what we see in the global population of users, right? So this is a pre-production prototype, actually, that works today, that allows you to look at your population of, in this case, EC2 instances, to specify which cluster you care to look at, it then automatically pulls out and specify the metrics you want to compare as well. And then it automatically pulls out the right benchmark and overlays that over what you are seeing in your environment, right? It will also show you what the utilization and performance based on those benchmarks look like over time for your infrastructure. It'll try to estimate the cost that you're incurring running this type of a workload. And then it will also figure out, based on the capacity of other types of instances available in similar class or different types of class, different sizes, and suggest to you what might, and this is quantitatively done, what might actually work for the workload that we are observing when compared to the benchmarks that we observe in the broader Sumo community, right? And tell you there are a couple of instances, one, none, depends on your workload, that would fit your workload, and it'll actually estimate, what kind of performance you will get, and it'll estimate what kind of cost curve you will incur if you were to choose to switch and leverage those instances instead. So now you're getting ready to go into production, right? And you have done all of the stuff up front. You're learning, you're absorbing essentially the wisdom of the community, and you're doing that in an accelerated way so that you don't have to discover everything yourself, right? Not everything has to be learned by everybody from the beginning, right? So what I want to now talk about is what happens now. You've deployed your application, you've tested it, and now it's out in front of your customers. How can the global context help you when you're running your application, running your infrastructure, right? And we're going to focus actually on security this time, right? How can the global context help you secure your environments better? And we're going to start by talking about a service that was on that chart earlier that I showed, that is essentially AWS's threat detection service. Some of you might use this service already. Amazon GuardDuty essentially scans your AWS environment, detects threats, their severities, and notifies you when it discovers things that look malicious in your account. Okay, pretty useful service. Lots of our customers use it. We were a beta partner with Amazon when this was being developed. And so I wanted to walk you through how this might be useful, how this global context might be useful as you are using GuardDuty and other technologies to secure your accounts. So what does GuardDuty do? First, it scans your environment and bucketizes every threat that it finds into these 10 categories. Access, crypto, persistence, behavior, backdoor access, things like that. And it turns out that this is the distribution, global distribution of events that occur in global AWS environments that are being scanned by GuardDuty, right? Vast majority fall into a few categories, right? So what does your threat profile look like in your environment? Do you know that? Would it be useful? Now, GuardDuty also stamps those threats that it communicates to you with severity. And that severity means one of three things. If it's low, AWS has determined that it is likely have been deflected, right? Meaning it did not succeed. Somebody tried to do something and it was deflected. If it's medium, it's suspicious and it's not determined whether it's been successful or not. If it's high, odds are this threat is active in your environment, okay? I can't really explain why almost 3/4 of these are kind of undetermined, but let's put that aside for a second. What it also looks like is that these threats, as you look at them on a global level, we're looking at 7 days here, look pretty uniform, right? Things don't change a lot in terms of what severities are being detected, right? It's not like one day, everybody gets attacked and all the high severity threats are there, and then another day they're not. It's pretty homogeneous across time. When you look at the actual threat categories that are being detected, they're also pretty homogeneous, right? The ratio of unauthorized access to reconnaissance to Trojan to backdoor does not change a lot as you go from day to day, right? And so the question here is, could you leverage this information to get a better understanding of your own security posture, right? So let's double click into that for a bit. Let me zoom in. Imagine that what I'm doing next is I'm taking a sliver of this graph of this river, and I'm going to zoom in on it and try to find localized peaks, okay? Try to remove the hay and find some needles, okay? So if I, in this case, take away everything that's not severity high and only look at the events that compose fewer than 10% of that high severity event load, this is what occurs. This zoom in has zoomed into some small subset of accounts that are being monitored. And what it turns out to, on that second day of this week that we were looking at, there was a massive spike of cryptocurrency mining pool communication from EC2 instances running in AWS. Unless you are a cryptocurrency mining company, you probably want to know whether this was you, right? If you were just looking at your data without the global context, the question is this normal? What are you supposed to get? Day 0 or day 1, right? And so what we've tried to do here is we've tried to encode this type of logic of removing the hay and showing all the needles into an application. And this is what that looks like. This is another pre-production app that if you guys are interested in helping us develop further, let me know. We'll happily work with you guys on this. But this is what it looks like, okay? So first of all, it's giving you the global benchmark of security categories. It's telling you, this is you in the blue bar, and the red line is what is normal, right? Are you experiencing more reconnaissance, more Trojans, more backdoors than the community? It's also going to look into the actual threats, and it's going to look for individual threats, and it's going to only show you the ones where you have a significantly higher proportion of those threats occurring in your environment than others. Some of these might be explained easily because of the type of business you are, but others might not, right? It will also look for extremely rare things, right? You know, it's hard to look for rare things if you don't know what's rare, but we now know what's rare. And so we will bubble up things that occur in your account that are rare globally. Things like, you know, successful suspicious console logins, right? Things like that. And so this global context can be extremely helpful in various use cases, right? It's not the only answer, but it is another vector to help you run, adopt, and improve how you utilize technologies, right? And to summarize this, leverage your modern apps report, leverage things that we're going to leverage through the product for adoption of your technologies, to accelerate that life cycle, leverage it to improve utilization, to deliver better performance, to lower your own cost without having to wait for quarters and quarters while you run this to learn all of this stuff on your own, and leverage this when you can, where it makes sense, when you're operating your technology, when you're securing your environments across technology that you adopt, right? We believe this can be helpful. This is going to be delivered in an agile fashion. Some of these things are available today. Other things are going to be rolling out over the next couple of quarters. And we're going to be heavily investing into this area of development at Sumo. So that's that. We are now ready for questions. And we'd love to hear from you, and also would love to work with you guys as we develop this further.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Sorry.
Is it available today? Is it available today for us to use?
Some aspects are. Modern apps report some of this data is. The dashboards that you saw are in pre-production, so they're not live yet. They're not ready for general consumption yet. But a couple of these will be available within the next 3 months.
I think my question is similar to his. Like, how does this? Is this more like a subscription level feature, or how does this feature come?
Can you, Rishi? Maybe can you repeat?
The feature. How do we Well, how does this work? Does this come? Is it more like a licensing based, or is the feature available for all of the customers that are already in there?
We haven't. Many of these things are going to be available across our platform. We haven't yet determined how this is going to be packaged, right? So it's still in development. And so in the next 2 to 3 months, we'll know basically how is this going to package, what is going to be delivered with the base platform, what might not be, and so on. So we'll keep you posted on that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Is there plans or thoughts of allowing users to be able to create their own benchmarks off of custom data?
Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, this was not a strategy session, but if it were, I would walk you through kind of the concept of global benchmarks, customized benchmarks that Dave was talking about, and then personal benchmarks that you can create. We will also probably allow you to request specific benchmarks to be created, right? And to allow us to let us know what matters to you in your workloads, in your security. And so we will eventually get to a place where you will be able to kind of run your own customized benchmarks on top of the global Sumo footprint.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Any other questions?
Curious if you guys have any plans to include DLP or data loss prevention in that dashboard.
So we have plans to do, so the core thing here about rolling out this type of capability is to make sure that what we're delivering to you, the benchmarks we're delivering, number one, we have enough data points, right? If we don't have enough data points, they're not going to be useful. Statistically significant number of data points need to be present. Number two, we need to isolate and identify important KPIs, right? Not just blast at you every KPI that exists under the sun and essentially give you a bunch of stuff that's going to give you false positives. So we do have plans across...
We're jumping in.
across full component stack for this, and we will deliver a roadmap soon. But we can talk later about what you're interested in. Are we done here?
No, you guys, come on. Sorry, Christian and I are just going to jump in for a second. We've taken over all of the sound, I think, including the speakers and other things. Thank you so much for the first part of the day. Christian had a couple things to talk about, and I'm going to talk about the keynote tomorrow. Christian.
All right, hello Sumo. How's everybody doing? Okay, we can do better. Hello Sumo. All right, very good, thank you. Just a couple of words. I'm Christian, co-founder and CTO here at Sumo. This just fills my heart with so much warmth. It's fucking awesome to see you guys all here. There we go. I wasn't supposed to say that. Anyways, it's how I feel. Thank you very much for being here. We've had excellent conversations already. I'm looking forward to more conversations for tomorrow, today and tomorrow. Thanks everybody for being here. And we just wanted to quickly highlight the general session tomorrow. We have yours truly and his truly, Bruno, at the product keynote, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I expect all of you to be here, so you should probably not, drink this much tonight. Or if you actually want to drink, at least drink through the entire night so you can roll in right at 9 a.m. All right. After that, we have a fantastic panel. We have Sarah here from Greylock, who is an investor in security and AI. We also have Pokemon here. You can catch them. I'm a big Pokemon Go fan, and the fact that these guys are a customer, and that John, who's running the security over there, agreed to come on this panel is another thing that is just really awesome. And we also have Anheuser-Busch here, so that goes back to the beer comment I made earlier, right? It all kind of always lines up. So, and then finally, we have a truly, truly special person, and I'll let Aaron introduce.
Okay, so we've been a little quiet about this, but so it was George Tenet, the ex-head of the Central Intelligence Agency during the Bush-Clinton years, is going to be here. He was one of the longest-standing running directors of Central Intelligence Agency. He's going to be here for a fireside chat with Ramin. It's the reason we're not webcasting the keynote tomorrow. It's going to be a frank conversation about what's going on in global cybersecurity, what he observed during the election with Russia and Facebook, and what does he think is so different about operating business today compared to 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. So he is very opinionated. He's been watching what's been going on at the political technological and policy level. So you're going to want to definitely make sure that you come and enjoy that conversation. So some group sessions start tomorrow morning at 7:30. Breakfast, 9 a.m. start for the keynote. We're going to take a little break now. We're going to have another set of sessions on the 5 tracks, and then we're going to have Oktoberfest starting at around 5 o'clock. Okay, thanks so much for a great first day so far. Thanks, bye. Anything?
Cheers.